Good evening, everyone. It's Mark Howard here again. Thanking everyone for being here for our 15th annual Kellogg Leadership Symposium. We are super excited to wrap up this wonderful three-day event with one of Kellogg's brightest and finest. When we went to Dean Corneli and asked who would she recommend we have on our lineup, you heard one of them the other day, Mr. Harry Kramer, and you're about to hear the second, General Bernie Banks, next. So we want to welcome Bernie here to the stage for our discussion and summary of best practices in leadership. I want to do just a quick intro, and then we'll jump right into some of the questions that you guys have shared with us. Bernie Banks is a noted expert on the subjects of leadership and organizational change. Currently, he is the Associate Dean of Leadership Development and Inclusion and a clinical professor of management at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Bernie retired from the Army as a brigadier general in 2016 after having successfully led West Point's Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership from 2012 to 2016. In addition to having studied leadership extensively, he has led multiple military units ranging in size from 10 to 3,000 plus people. And in 1995, Bernie was selected from over 40,000, let me repeat, 40,000 officers to receive the Army's top award for entry-level managers, the General Douglas MacArthur Leadership Award. A West Point graduate, Bernie holds graduate degrees from Northwestern, Columbia, and Harvard universities. And with that, I want to welcome you, Bernie, to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's wonderful to be here today.
Glad you could take time out of your schedule to wrap up this symposium for us. Let me throw a softball question to you to start this off. What would you consider your secret sauce? Or what are the 2 or 3 things that have helped you most in your career to get you to where you're at now?
Secret sauce. Well, I think my secret sauce isn't so secret. It comes back to the basics, which is typically rooted in shared accountability along with mutual interdependence. None of us do anything in isolation. And so how do you become a good team member, great teammate? But additionally, how do you foster accountability for your own actions and also ensure there's accountability for the actions of those around you? So being a great teammate, being accountable usually results in positive outcomes. Now, when I think about my own leadership philosophy, my leadership philosophy is rooted in 8 core tenets: focus, preparation, rehearsal, disciplined execution, safety, values, diverse and inclusive teams. So focus, that's all about prioritization of effort. Leaders have to prioritize efforts for their team members. When we talk about preparation, you have to prepare as if what you're doing matters. Those who would say, if you use the metaphor of sports, practice doesn't matter. It's all about what you do in a game. You will play in the game how you practiced. So preparation always matters. Rehearsals. I find that people in organizations that rehearse their efforts outperform those that don't, because that's where you can really drive home understanding of intent, where you can plan for contingencies. Disciplined execution is all about adherence to standards. For me, I'm not somebody who asks my teams to go above and beyond. I will always reward them when they do. What I ask my teams to do is to go where they're supposed to go, when they're supposed to go, do what they're supposed to do when they're there, and do that every single time. Excellence, in my mind, is all about adherence to standards. And I believe that if you can adhere to standards always, you're going to outperform countless other organizations that only adhere to standards episodically. There's only 3 types of accountability: accountable, partially accountable, or unaccountable. I strive to create teams, and I strive as an individual to always be accountable. So that's all about disciplined execution. When we think about safety, people are your most valuable resource. Treat them as such. Then we talk about the importance of effective communications. Leadership is all about influence. It's not about being in charge. So do you communicate in an effective manner? Values. If you find yourself in an ambiguous circumstance, point yourself in the direction of your core values and you'll be headed in the right direction. Values shouldn't be something that's just on a card or on a wall. They should be reflected in your actions every single day. And then the last one is diverse and inclusive teams. Diversity is never the objective. Inclusion is. If you build diverse and inclusive teams, you will better address complex challenges. We know from research that heterogeneous teams outperform homogeneous teams when addressing complex challenges. And so you want to find people who think, behave, and challenge in very intentional ways. And you want to harness all that. So, I used to think it was just about having diverse teams, but diversity efforts don't fail because we can't find diverse people or ideas. They fail because we find them and then encourage them to act in a homogeneous manner. You have to leverage the difference. That's why inclusion is so important. And so those are my 8 core principles, but they always come back to this notion of mutual accountability, shared responsibility, being a great team member, always being accountable.
Yeah, so you're talking about leadership, but you're also talking about the concept of team and making everyone on the team accountable. In the light of this stay-at-home environment that we're finding ourselves in with the pandemic, compounded with the heightened awareness of some of the values that have been brought about by the Black Lives Matter movement, do you think a different type of leadership is needed now? I mean, you mentioned your 8 core tenets there. Is there any one that's more important now? Are they all the same? Is it different, because of the environment that we're in? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. The process that is leadership has not fundamentally been altered. The context in which we have to lead is always shifting. And so those basics are still the basics. We have to still create clear direction. We have to still create alignment. We have to still galvanize commitment in service of attaining a predetermined outcome. So those 3 outcomes haven't changed. The context in which we're doing those things most certainly has shifted. But if we go back to the basics are the basics for a reason, those basics are still present. So when we look at some of the mistakes that leaders commonly make, not taking time to bond with people, in a remote work environment, the challenge associated with that could be exacerbated. But the basic need to do it is still the same. Being unavailable or inaccessible. Once again, that's something that could most certainly be exacerbated by a remote work environment, but that basic principle is still the same. You need to be available to your folks and you need to be engaged with your folks. Another mistake that leaders frequently make, not focusing on developing talent. You can't acquiesce on that simply because the talent's not all in the same building. Not giving regular feedback about performance. You still have that obligation, even in a remote environment. So many of the things that we frequently see cited by employees as shortcomings they perceive in their leaders, those same things are present right now, but the environment is exacerbating the likelihood that those common mistakes transpire. And so I submit that even in this environment, you should stay committed to doing the basics well. The basics are the basics for a reason. And the organizations and leaders who commit themselves to doing those basics well every single day, they're successfully navigating the turbulence because they understand everything stems from how good they are at the basics. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, no, it totally does. Getting back to the basics, the blocking and tackling, using a sports metaphor, you hear that a lot. but 2020, it just felt like it was a little unique, where.
Oh, absolutely. It is a unique context.
Yeah. I mean, uncertainty was magnified times 10 of, 1 week you're mourning the death of Kobe Bryant. The next it's the pandemic and am I going to die tomorrow? And then the next it's the stock market crashing. And so it just seemed like it was a new normal of craziness.
It most certainly created a heightened level of anxiety, but a leader's job is to help people frame things. It's to help them understand where are we going, what's necessary for us to get there, and then to sustain their willingness to expend the necessary energy going forward. So the environment most certainly amplified the challenge associated with that, yet the same basic elements have always been present, even in the midst of all this turbulence. And so the leaders that were able to get their teams to take a breath and understand that those things hadn't changed and that we will be able to find our way through this if we ensure that we're committing ourselves to doing that which is necessary to bring about those three outcomes, they had a much easier time. What happens many times is people will inject the wrong kind of anxiety into the organization. They'll amp people up even more than they need to be. And here's what we know to be true. There's a thing called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's about physiological response to stress. And it says that as stress increases, so does performance. But it gets to a point where you're at optimal performance based on the amount of stress you're encountering. You continue to stress beyond that, and performance actually declines. And so the leader's job, when they see the trail off due to too much stress, is to back it off to where they can still get people to optimal performance. And so as leaders take a look at their teams and everything, and they're seeing how are they responding to the stress, you obviously saw teams respond in an outstanding manner as the stakes went up because of all the turbulence. But then they had to make sure they were managing the amount of anxiety, because if they let it get too great, they were going to start to see a dip in performance. So you always have to look at where are we at on that curve? Where are we at on that curve? Because sometimes you're like, we need to induce more stress. Other times, we need to reduce the stress. And that's the key to being a good leader, understanding your team and what it needs, where it's at.
Well, when we talked a little earlier this week, you had mentioned a couple of example companies who you felt really faced the uncertainty and the challenges that were unique of 2020 and took it as an opportunity to evolve and change. Can you talk a little bit about some of those companies that you really admired as to how they approached the changes and challenges of 2020?
Yeah, I'll just talk about one. So many folks on here are probably familiar with Spotify. It's a music streaming service, free in nature for a lot of its programming. However, they do have some programming that's for premium subscribers. It's firewalled. So when Spotify happened, people thought, hey, more folks are going to be listening to music because they're now trapped in their homes. However, that service was highly dependent on ad revenue. Consequently, people are like, great, people are going to be trapped at home. They're going to be listening to music, all this stuff. However, advertisers start to reduce their spend as this thing weared on. And so now you're like, whoa, advertising dollars are going down. What are we going to do? There was a great article that was written by Mauro Guillen in Harvard Business Review that said for the smart companies, they were going to use this as an opportunity to make smart pivots, not a complete overhaul of their business plan, but basically moving laterally so they can move forward. And that three things had to happen in order for them to do that well. One, whatever that sidestep was, it had to be aligned with a long-term trend that was emerging in the marketplace. Two, it had to be a lateral extension of a capability you already had and that you were going to seek to amplify. And then three, it had to be something that had the prospect of creating sustainable profitability. So you couldn't do something that was just going to put you in a big hole. And so if we go back to Spotify, so Spotify, hey, ad revenues declining, plus the royalties we're having to pay are increasing for content we don't own. And so how can we create a model whereby we can create greater revenue? So what they did was a lateral pivot to say, we need to create more original content. And the way they found that was podcasts. So let's not only buy podcasts, but let's also create podcasts where we own the content. So the royalties we're paying out to other parties, that money we keep. Additionally, we can then firewall the most popular content so that premium subscribers who are paying for our service only get access to that. So they did things like they own Joe Rogan's podcast. That podcast alone is worth $100 million in revenue and a variety of other things. And so they start to curate these podcasts so that the most popular ones you could only get access to through the premium subscription service. And so now they make this lateral pivot from music into podcast. They start creating additional original content that they own, changes their revenue model, and that creates long-term profitability options for them, because this was a service that historically had been losing money, even though it was growing. And so it was a great example of a company that saw an opportunity to make a lateral pivot to then accelerate, building off a capability they already possessed, making sure it was still in line with where we saw the future of the market going, and seizing the turbulence to say, hey, now's a great time to do this. And you had lots of other companies that did similar things. Now, if a company was already in a space whereby they didn't have to do anything, just the environment was going to accelerate them, like Zoom. Zoom never thought they were going to get as big as they got.
Right.
In the amount of time that happened. They didn't do anything special. They just were in right place, right time. Same thing with a number of other companies that were in industries that suddenly those things became things we needed. So those folks, yeah, they were built for success. But the ones that said, hey, we've got to make some sort of change in order to continue to maintain our ability to be successful going forward, things like Spotify, even Airbnb, for example. As Airbnb is, people renting homes and stuff decreased, they said, hey, what are we going to do to continue to be relevant? Well, they said, let's go from just connecting hosts to being more of a lifestyle organization where we can curate things like cooking and so overall market cap decreased, but overall company capabilities and how the company was being positioned actually expanded. So you do have these companies that have been able to find a way to not only survive, but to actually thrive and create new capabilities because of taking advantage of the environmental disruption.
Yeah, and those are two very different examples. Like you said, Zoom was right place, right time. But you do respect the pivoting that Spotify made. I mean, it begs the question of why we don't, you and I, Bernie, go out and make a podcast of our own. I mean, holy moly, Joe Rogan is like on top of the world. It's amazing what just conversations between, people and people want to tune in just like this. I mean, the wonderful people we have here at the Symposium, and you see people are eager for the different perspectives. So very interesting.
Content is king.
Content is king
in media, which is why you see like Netflix and others. I mean, take Netflix, for example. So you see Netflix, Amazon Prime. It's no longer just about hosting movies made by somebody else. They're all producing their own content now.
Oh, yeah.
Netflix is going to come out with a new movie every week in 2021.
Oh, yeah.
Every single week. And so because of that, because of content now being king, things like the startup that was being run by Meg Whitman, where they had $1 billion in startup capital, and that company went under like that, Quibi, because Quibi was all predicated on if people are on the move, while they're on the move, doing this, that, or the other, they're going to want to watch some short content. But now people are stuck at home and they don't want to watch a 7-minute feature. They're going to stream a full 30-minute or hour thing. And so $1 billion in capital went up like that because the model didn't match the environment's needs. It was amazing. It was amazing.
That is. I wasn't aware of I knew that Quibi hadn't made it, but I hadn't even thought about it that way. We have a question from a participant. Saul Cordero is asking, from your military experience, how do you sustain team engagement in a prolonged war or pandemic?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Saul. So one, continue to reinforce the primacy of the mission. If the mission is still an important one, you've got to get people to stay focused on, we have not accomplished the mission yet, and we need to accomplish the mission, and here's why. So always stay focused on the primacy of the mission. 2, always ensure you're attending to the needs of your people. You can become so myopically focused on a task that you're ignoring the people who are actually performing the task. And so I've got a little checklist for how I deal with my folks. Always 5 C's. When's the last time I connected with them? What have I communicated with them? What's the current challenge I'm issuing to them? How am I showing compassion? Those sort of things I'm always keeping in the back of my mind, because my job is to put them in a position to win. I have to be a champion for their success, not just hope they're successful, do everything in my power to make them successful. And so if I can ensure that I'm keeping them focused on the right things while ensuring I'm doing the right things to attend to their needs, usually that sustains commitment over time. But I always start from the place of mission first and foremost. But it's mission first, people always. Mission first, people always.
So we're getting people asking, what are those 5 C's again? And I was thinking, man, we need a teleprompter on here to because you're dropping some nuggets. I'm like, okay, what were those 8 tenets? What are the 5 C's again?
Yeah, contact. When's the last time I spoke with them? Communications. What's the last time I shared something with them that was important? Challenge. What am I doing to make them better? Compassion. How am I making sure I'm taking care of their needs? And then, just collaboration. How am I making sure that I'm involving them in a substantive way in what we're doing? Making sure that we have true connection. So just 5 simple C's. So that if I know, I haven't spoken to somebody in the last couple of days, then I make it a point. But even in the midst of this challenging time, I'm always like, what am I doing to make them better? That's the challenge part. The compassion part is, do I know what's going on in their lives? I mean, one of the things that these remote platforms have done, they've invited people into our homes. And so when your kid runs behind you, or when, they hear your dog barking or whatever, those are things that previously folks did not get a glimpse of. And some folks, are so apologetic, and I'm like, there's no need to apologize for having a life. We do what we do in the hopes that you can build a great life. And so when I see their kids, I'm always like, hey, how's it going? When I hear the dog barking, I'm like, what kind of dog is that? And then I'll hold up my dog, or
right.
It's my Ring doorbell. I've got a life too. So, it's mission first, people always. That was something I was taught in the military. The mission is always what we are committed to performing, but understand that mission cannot be accomplished without human beings. And what are you doing to take care of them and to make them better and to make them successful? I submit that one of a leader's most important obligations is to put their people in a position to win. And that's funny because research indicates 60 to 75% of employees cite that the most stressful part of their job is their immediate supervisor. And overwhelmingly, the research indicates that when people leave companies, they don't leave for money. They're looking for better people.
Right. Oh, yeah. You hear it all the time. So that's a segue to another question that was posed of, we have a lot of business school graduates on the call here at the symposium, presumably to have either learned a skill change careers, get some credibility. What's your notion on leaders are born versus made?
The classic question.
Because and so you talked about people leave their jobs because of crappy people and crappy leaders.
Not even necessarily because of crappy people or crappy leaders, because this goes in part to the question. So the answer is they're both. They are born and made, but it's not exclusively one or the other. It's a combo deal. Research indicates approximately 33% of what accounts for leader effectiveness can be traced back to genetic predispositions, gifts that we have, intellect, extroversion, name your thing. And so is it important to be the smartest person in the room? No, but you have to be smart enough for whatever context in which you operate. Do you have to be an extrovert in order to be an outstanding leader? No. Research indicates there's zero difference between introverts and extroverts. It's just that introverts must learn how to effectively display extroversion when the situation calls for it. Some of the most accomplished leaders of all time are tremendous introverts, but they know how to display extrovert behavior when required. And so those predispositions can most certainly be helpful. But 66% of what accounts for leadership effectiveness is gleaned through experiences that one amasses over time. So everyone can become better at the elements associated with the process of leading. It does not mean that everyone will become an outstanding leader, but we can all get better, which is why we spend so much time thinking about how do we get better as leaders. So I can pick somebody based on having certain genetic predispositions, but then I've got to wrap them in a lot of different experiences and ensure they learn effectively from those experiences in order to amplify the likelihood that they can successfully contend with whatever challenges and opportunities they are being presented. So leaders are born and made, but they're overwhelmingly made.
Gotcha. Okay, there it is. Definitively made, and some few are born. And so we had a tangential question to that from Mariano Gonzalez, so if that's the case, if you can be made, then what are some points of wisdom for some new managers who are emerging in the marketplace of things that you would especially ask them to do to craft their skill of being a great leader?
Wow. Well, there's always those foundational elements. Learn how to become an effective communicator. Learn how to deliver and receive feedback. Learn to become comfortable with holding people accountable. Learn how to engage in experimentation. I mean, the list goes on and on. But I think, at the end of the day, the thing you're always trying to think about is, how do I become more accountable? How do I learn more effectively? And how do I ensure that I'm becoming more influential, which always comes back to how do I become more trusted? Here's the interesting thing about leadership. There's no single universally agreed upon definition of this thing we call leadership. But of all the definitions that have ever been conceived, not one of them says must be in charge. Not one. So many times people think of leadership as a role someone occupies. And that most certainly can be the case. But leadership is simply a process of influence. And if it is a process of influence, one of the things that informs how influential you are is how trusted you are. And so I tell every young manager, in order to become a better leader, you have to become more trusted. And so there's this thing called the George trust equation. And he uses the symbology of a numerator denominator, like a division equation, to highlight the elements of trust. So in the numerator, up top, you have credibility plus reliability plus intimacy. So relative to whatever context in which you're operating, are you credible? So as a young leader, you should strive to become technically competent. Reliability. That's the extent to which you honor your commitments. As a young leader, you should strive to always follow through on your commitments, what I call the say-do ratio. I want your say-do ratio to be 1-to-1. If I say it, I do it. And then intimacy is all about the creation of psychological safety. You manage things, you lead people. Do you take the time to get to know your people? In the denominator, he had self-orientation, which is nothing more than interest alignment. Do you ensure that what's in it for you and what's in it for them are congruent? And the thing that undermines trust the fastest is when there's a perceived lack of interest alignment. But in the numerator, the thing that erodes trust the fastest is a lack of credibility. And so I tell young leaders, you want to become a better leader? Become more trusted and work on those 4 things. Know your people, follow through on your commitments, become a master of your craft, and always ensure that what you're doing is not only in your best interest, but it's also in the interest of those you're trying to have do things on your behalf. You better make sure that you're taking care of them. So those are just some of the things I think.
Yeah, the congruency, like you said, of what's in it for them and you has to be equal at best. So we had someone ask, what's the name of the equation again?
Oh, the trust equation. Trust
and
equation.
You said it was
George.
By George.
2000. Like if you Google trust equation, I guarantee it'll come up.
Okay. Gotcha. So let's switch a little bit to more personal to you. A question that was asked is, who were some of your mentors and influencers that have affected you the most throughout your career?
Yeah. So, this is always an interesting one when people say, tell me a leader you admire or, and they always think they're going to go to the great man or great woman. But the people who have been the most successful leaders in my life are much closer to home. So I'll start with my grandfather on my father's side. So my grandfather, Hayes, was a heavy equipment operator for the Meade Corporation, and he lived in Lynchburg, Virginia, which is the home of Liberty University, which was founded by Jerry Falwell. So this is a city in the southern part of Virginia. And my grandfather and my grandmother both had 6th grade educations. And my grandfather was a heavy equipment operator. So he used to take these big logs, move from one place to another at this processing plant for the Meade Corporation. So 2 individuals with 6th grade educations had 6 children, 5 boys, 1 girl. And all of my uncles and aunts went to segregated high schools in Lynchburg. Now, those 2 folks with 6th grade educations put all 6 of their children through college successfully. And every one of them went on to become a very successful professional. And so as a young child, when I would go visit my grandparents, I would hear them extol the virtues of education, to extol the virtues of hard work, to extol the virtues of living a principled life. And when you were a child in that family, when you came for any holiday, you'd walk into the kitchen. Invariably, my grandmother would be in there humming a hymn. Everybody would be talking around this table all loud. You'd show up, lots of hugs and everything. And then if you were one of the offspring of the 6, they'd sit you in that chair right in the center of the room at the table. And we called it the Banks hot seat. And they'd start grilling you on your life. What are you doing in school? Blah, 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 blah. And you knew it was coming. And, some of my cousins used to lament that. And I used to view it as a gift because the questions were posed because they had a genuine desire to help foster your success. And so when I think about the values my grandfather instilled in his children and in his grandchildren, and I think about what it means to be a leader, I can think of no finer leader than my grandfather because he was dedicated to his family. He was dedicated to his community. He invested in countless people in ways that bore fruit that has, flourished for decades. And the lessons that he imposed on me, I seek to impose on my children and also on my teammates. And so people like my grandfather, there's people I've worked with professionally like Archie Davis, who was the senior non-commissioned officer in an organization I was leading in the Republic of South Korea. He was technically and tactically competent, tough but fair, somebody who was dedicated to ensuring that we always met standards. And I have a concept called hug and push. I think the best leaders always hug and push. They're always going to push you to get better. They're never going to let moss grow beneath your feet. But the entire time they're pushing you, they've got their arms wrapped around you saying, you can do this, we can do this. And so my grandfather was a hug and push leader. Archie Davis was a hug and push leader. I've met countless other hug and push leaders. And in every instance, when I found somebody like that, from the time I met them to the time I departed their physical presence, we got better. We got better. And so, I always am hesitant to highlight one person given how many people have made a positive difference in my life. So I'm more fond of highlighting the characteristics of those who've made a positive difference in my life. And I always go back to this notion of hug and push, that the most effective leaders I've found, they hug and push simultaneously.
That's another good Bernie-ism we'll take away from the day, hug and push. And so do you put your people you work with there at Kellogg in the bank's hot seat at times?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what you do with students, right? That's what you do with colleagues. You'll sit a student down and go, not just what do you want to do post Kellogg, but why? What impact do you want to make on the world? What's your legacy going to be? Legacy comes from the Latin word legatus, which means person delegated, which means the ancients ascribed to that word this notion that your story will not be told by you. So when someone else gets to tell your story, will the narrative they share be commensurate with the one you were intent on crafting? Every single day, we're forging a legacy. Is it going to be one that ultimately we can be intensely proud of? Or are we going to lament our legacy because the things that people elect to say about us are not as flattering or as impactful as we'd like them to be? And so I want students to think about legacy, not just what job are they going to take post Kellogg. I want to become a consultant. I'm like, great. What difference do you want to make in the world as a consultant? Think beyond the immediacy of, I want this on my resume and I want this as a salary. Think about impact. Think about what are you going to give, not simply what are you going to take. And those are hard questions to wrestle with. You start posing things like that to folks and they'll squirm.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. But it's good to be put in that spotlight, so that you do start to think about those things and you do start to put your own personality around it so that you can create, the life that you're meant to lead. We have a very diverse audience of lots of women, from across the globe, people from across the globe, brown, white, everybody. What would you give advice to a woman or a minority who's finding themselves, where they've been appointed a leadership role? Because, we look at the Fortune 100, it's still, not as diverse as we'd like it at the C-level suite. So what advice?
It's woefully divergent from the overall demographics.
Yeah. And so what advice would you give to a female or minority leader who maybe is now in charge of a majority group of men? Is there any different approach that you would guide them as to how to approach that leadership role?
So strip away gender and focus on impact. It's what am I doing to put each one of my people in a position to win? That's it. So if I'm a woman leading a man, what am I doing to help put them in a position to win? If I'm a man leading a woman, what am I doing to put her in a position to win? You have to be a champion for your people, not primarily a critic. And so, yes, that can be a challenging context. Absolutely. But the thing is, your success is rooted in their success. I tell every one of my bosses, listen, I'm here to make you wildly successful. It's not a popularity contest. And I've seen people that because they don't like their boss, they actively seek to undermine their boss. I'm like, how's that going to turn out for you if things turn out poorly for them?
Right.
The same thing's true about your subordinates. You're like, well, I've seen folks that will sit there and say, well, I don't want to hire people who are better than me because they could take my job. I'm like, guess what? If your team crushed it and they end up in your job, it's usually because you're getting a promotion. So you want to undermine your team because you don't want anybody to challenge the status quo so you can stay in the same role forever? I'm like, that just doesn't make sense to me. So when you're in a role, your number one obligation, make your team successful because your team's going to make you successful. And then figure out what's necessary to do that for each person on your team, because it's going to be a little different for each one. But you've got to be a champion. You've got to be a champion.
Champion for your people. So strip away gender, strip away race, and just figure out what is it that is going to be better for them and for the team. Got it. It's often simple, but sometimes hard to execute. So
it's easy. It's easy to talk about this stuff. The hard part's to do it. I teach a course on leader development at Kellogg, and I say there's nothing in this course that you're going to have a hard time understanding conceptually. The challenge is going to be finding the courage to do it well. I can talk all day long about feedback, how it's a gift and everything, right? But do you have the conviction to actually give effective feedback that's objective, timely, devoid of judgment, behaviorally anchored, and to do that over and over and over again?
And we've heard that quite a bit throughout, the other speakers of, Harry talks about value-based leadership. Doug Conant just now, values-based leadership and having the action and courage to do what's right, always do what is right. And so, again, it sounds so simple, but in the face of adversity and challenges, are you going to do, the right thing when no one's looking, So, so another question that came in from the crowd was, what would you say is the most dangerous trait in a leader? You've talked a lot about what are some things that people should do, and I don't know if it's obvious that the opposite of it is dangerous.
I'd say it's hubris. Hubris.
So hubris. All right.
When you think you're better than everyone, you won't listen to anyone. And when you don't listen, you can't have an accurate understanding of how you're impacting things around you. And so hubris and a lack of integrity, killers. I once had somebody tell me something that's always stuck with me. They look for three things when they hire someone: someone who's smart, someone who's driven, and someone who's principled. And whatever you do, don't hire someone who's high on the first two and lacks the third, because a smart person who's driven will quickly drive you out of business if they don't believe in the right things. And so, you have to have people who are principled. You have to have people who are open to receiving input from others. Hubris will also crush you because it'll marginalize your willingness to learn new things. And what we know to be true from research is the number one indicator of potential is past performance, but the number two indicator of potential is how effectively somebody learns. And you can't learn well if you don't receive feedback effectively. And if you can't learn, as soon as the context shifts, you're done. And the context is shifting faster today than it ever has. And the speed of that shift is continuing to accelerate.
Indeed. So on that concept of learning, are there any concepts that you want to dive deeper in yourself personally this year, from a learning perspective?
Oh, no, yeah. Well, absolutely. So I took the role, my role was expanded at Northwestern Kellogg last July. So I had been the Associate Dean for Leadership Development. Then I became the Associate Dean for Leadership Development and inclusion. They added 2 words. They added a mountain of things associated with those 2 words. And I was the first one to say, I am not an expert in topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I took the role in part because it was going to be a growth opportunity. I was going to have to learn a raft of new things in order to be able to assist the school in achieving its desired aims. And so I'm on a learning journey like countless others to understand the complexity associated with how do you truly create equitable and inclusive experiences for diverse workforces. And I've learned a lot since July, but what I've learned pales in comparison to what I need to learn in order to effectively assist the school going forward. And it's important for the school because here's what we know to be true, that currently there are approximately 7.7 billion people on the planet. By approximately 2050, that number will be up to 9.7 billion. So 2 billion in growth. 1 billion out of the 2 billion in growth is going to come from just 7 countries, one of which is the United States. But what's common across those 7 countries, the majority of growth is coming from people of color. Population in Europe is expected to decrease. Population in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to explode. So we look at global mobility, and global mobility is expected to stay fairly constant. So people working outside their country of origin as a percentage. But there's going to be 2 billion more people thrown in to that number. And so what we know is organizations are going to continue to become increasingly more diverse along a whole slew of dimensions. So whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, intellectual orientation, name your thing. And so the leader who elects not to develop as one of their superpowers a commitment to behaving inclusively and to fostering inclusive environments is going to be at a competitive disadvantage, as are their firms, if they don't learn how to harness that difference effectively. And so for me, the forcing function of entering into this job created a tremendous learning opportunity that would help me remain relevant given what we know to be true about demographic trends going forward. And so I am spending lots of time learning about countless things that get lumped under diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then trying to prioritize our efforts and go about delivering on those in a rigorous way. Because you can't change everything, but you have to think about, if we could change one thing and make the biggest difference, what would it be and why? And then try to figure out, all right, what will it take for us to do that effectively? And then to go at it with dogged commitment. So I am being beat up intellectually every single day, Mark. It is a fight.
Yeah, no, and that takes some strength and courage to take on such a big and broad role, like you said, with just those 2 words, because that is a momentous task for sure. DE&I. You know, we've had a couple of speakers, some that you're familiar with. Tracy Carmen Jones had a wonderful session. We had Jenny Clark was on, and Cynthia
wonderful.
Bowman.
Yep.
And so we've had some great conversations on just that topic alone. So we'd love to hear more about your experiences, maybe with the talk later this year. But we're running a little bit out of time. What I want to ask you is, maybe one last question of, give us an example of where you feel you took a huge risk in your career that paid off, and how did it pay off for you?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Choosing to go pursue a PhD. So I was an operator in the military. I ran organizations. And the opportunity presented itself for me to teach at West Point. And I took the opportunity the first time, went and taught for 2 years, had a really successful tour there, was selected for entry into the executive ranks in the Army, was leaving the organization to go take my first general manager role. And they said, wait, we'd love for you to come back following that role. And I was like, well, and in order to come back, I'd have to get my PhD. Now, getting a doctorate was something that was never on my list of things to do. I was not one of those folks that had already determined at a young age, yes, I want to go get a doctorate. And so I had a lot of opportunities to continue to move up in the operations career field, if you would. But the intellectual challenge posed by getting a top flight PhD was one that terrified me and at the same time excited me. And so I told them I will only do it if I can go to one of the finest schools in the world, to really be pushed. And I was fortunate to gain acceptance to Columbia. And it was hard. Getting a PhD in a psychology-related discipline is a lot of math. A lot of math. And I am not somebody who is the first to characterize themselves as quantitatively oriented. And so I was like, oh, this is going to be challenging. And so when you're in your doctoral program, first 2 to 3 years, you're taking courses, and then you take this big examination called your comprehensive examinations. It's a regurgitation of all the salient literature relative to whatever it is you've been studying. It's exceptionally demanding and very anxiety producing. And so it's time for my comps. Now, I knew the literature. I knew the eaches of the thing I was studying, but the math was still, it was just a lot of math.
Yeah.
So I go in for my comps, and, once again, in an MBA program, you've got 500, 1,000 classmates. In a PhD program, you might have 2 people in your doctoral program in your discipline. So it's a really small place. And so I go into my comps and I fail them by one question. It was a really difficult quantitative question. I fail it. They come back. They tell you, now, failing your comps is not common. And so they come back and they're like, well, Bernie, you had some challenges. I'm like, well, what happened? So they tell me, and they're like, take some time. So I go home, cry like a baby that night. My kids come in. They're like, Dad, what's wrong? I'm like, I put all your lives at risk. Daddy screwed up. Oh, God, I'm a failure. This is terrible.
You're a failure.
And so they're like all hugging me. And I'm like, I just need 24 hours to wallow. Come 24 hours in 1 minute, Dad's going to be back, and he's going to have more resolve than ever. So 24 hours I wallow, 24 hours, 1 minute, I'm like, let's go. So I march back into my program. I'm like, all right, when can I take them again? And they're like, Bernie, if you fail them again, you're out of the program. And I'm like, when can I take them again? They're like, take a year. I'm like, take a year? I'm not taking a year. I'm doing this right now. I'm like, when can I take the exam again? The soonest you can take it again is in a month. I'm like, put it on the calendar. Let's go. And they're like, if you fail, Bernie, you're out. I go, I don't fear failure. I fear having the courage to try. Now, what had happened was I got test anxiety. So I went back, redoubled my efforts, prayer, they're like, we don't have to tell anybody. I'm like, I'm telling everybody because I need help. If I don't
right.
I need the help. So people would ask, how'd it go? Knowing that the answer was going to be, oh, yeah, I passed. It was good. And when I'd say, no, I screwed up, they're like, what, really? And I'm like, yeah, and here's where I need your help. And so I had peers come in. They're like, yeah, we'll get you there. And thank God they did. They put their arms on me, and, I was like, and they helped me with things. And so I went back in and I crushed it.
Wonderful.
But if I hadn't had the courage to try, if I hadn't had the courage to tell others that I needed help, if I didn't have the courage to step into what I knew was going to be a challenging process, I would have never yielded the benefits that came out of the PhD because it transformed how I think. It also reaffirmed what I believe to be my personal courage, because I've always felt that I am willing to take on anything. I won't always succeed, but you will not spook me into not doing it. I'm like, no, that's not going to be me. And so doing that opened up an entire new avenue of professional pursuit. I never had an intention to become a professional educator. I was an operator. But having had the courage to go do that has now resulted in my ability to have the privilege of being at one of the finest graduate schools of management in the world. because of that willingness to take a risk and, to seek something that was going to be hard.
Man, that's a wonderful story for us to end on. The courage, the vulnerability, taking risks. And we've heard, some of the other speakers talk about, it's okay to fail, just learn from it quickly, fail quickly, don't, blow all the budget and jump right back in, which is exactly what you did. You didn't want to waste too much time. You want to get right back out there and ask for help, ask for help. That's wonderful. Well, I want to thank Bernie for your time. We've had lots of comments talking about when are you writing a book so we can get these nuggets of wisdom. Want to send out a special thanks to the entire Kellogg Graduate School of Management. Dean Cornelli has extended her best and finest with Bernie, with Harry, with alums, and with Doug Conant and all the great staff there. It's been wonderful. For you guys who are still around, we have great networking up next with our happy hour hosted by Tito's Handmade Vodka. So at 5 o'clock, we encourage you to shift over to the networking and the happy hour so we can do some more mingling and close out the session with a bang. But Bernie, I want to thank you again. This has been awesome. And I'm sure everyone here on the Symposium thanks you for your honest feedback, your honest insight, and your nuggets of wisdom.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thanks to the Kellogg Alumni Network of Texas for hosting this event. 15 years is quite a run, and my hope is that it goes on for 15 more.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.